welcome to my channel, Andrea Marino Polyglot Experience. This is Andrea here, and in today's video I'd like to give you an overview of how we really learn languages. When we talk about language learning, within the language learning community there are so many different voices. Everyone seems to have their own agenda, claiming that one method or technique is more effective than all the others. There is a lot of propaganda out there about supposedly effective techniques and methods, with proponents of one approach trying to discredit others. Quite often you come across people trying to convince you that if you follow a particular method, you learn a language quickly and efficiently, and maybe even in an incredible short amount of time. Let's be honest, most of the time these claims set unrealistic expectations and are little more than marketing tactics. You see, the truth is that language learning is a complex process that involves several different components. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. In this video, I'll try to simplify things for you. I'm going to walk you through a simple but powerful framework I've developed, one that shows how we actually learn languages. This video is going to be a little bit longer than I intended, but bear with me because I'm going to touch so many important aspects of language learning. This is still a condensed overview, but it's important because it helps you understand the overall process. It shows that learning a language isn't about rigid methods or choosing one approach over another. It's about understanding the balance between passive exposure and active use. And I think this is a great starting point to help you build awareness, to help you realize where you are in your language learning journey and what you can do to improve to become more efficient in learning languages, in learning your target language. And this is especially true if you're a busy adult with limited free time and the need to make the most of it. There's a lot of advice out there promoting techniques and methods that require hours of daily practice, which simply isn't realistic for people managing work, family, children, and other responsibilities. Alright, let's move on. Let's start by defining the first key concept. The linguist Stephen Krashen argues that there are two ways to develop language abilities: acquisition on one hand and study on the other hand. Acquiring a language means building an intuitive knowledge of it. This is essentially how we learn our native language, how children learn their mother tongue. Most of us don't know grammar rules, yet we instinctively know what sounds right and what doesn't. And this is a more intuitive and natural way of learning languages. Studying a language, on the other hand, means learning about the language. And this is the approach commonly used in traditional education. Learning languages solely through study is what's known as the skill building approach. Of course, as many of you have experienced, this approach alone doesn't work. And relying solely on acquisition might not be sufficient either, as it often requires a lot of time. The good news is that as adults, we can combine these two approaches and take the best out of both. Another important point to keep in mind is that language learning is often seen as a single skill, but that's not the case. There are actually four different skills: two passive skills, listening and reading, which is our input, and two active skills, writing and speaking, our output. The two passive skills represent the comfort zone in a way, and you start learning or acquiring a language through these skills. The active skills, on the other hand, require you to activate your vocabulary. And it's important to keep this distinction in mind because these 4 skills involve different areas of the brain, and you need to train them in different ways. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all method for learning a language. Instead, progress comes from working on a variety of complementary skills and habits. Now let's go into a bit more detail about what passive skills are. You can read books in your target language, for example, graded readers, browse online resources, read news articles, and so on when it comes to reading. As for listening, the content can come in many forms: podcasts, YouTube videos, films, TV series, and so on. And when reading and listening come together, for example, watching a YouTube video with subtitles or using a podcast with a transcript, it's even better because you are practicing both passive skills at the same time. But the selection of content is crucial. You need material that is both comprehensible and engaging. Content you actually enjoy, ideally on topics you're already familiar with. Why? Bear with me. When it comes to passive skills, comprehensible input is key. By this I mean content that's just above your current level, where you understand enough to follow what's going on, but you're still being exposed to new words, structures, and expressions. So you learn something new. Ideally, you should be able to recognize about 80-90% of the words, and the remaining 10-20% you can infer from the context. This is sometimes referred to as the 80-20 rule, and you don't need to look up or translate every unknown word because the meaning is usually clear enough from the context. And this is really important because if you choose a content in which you can understand pretty much everything, you won't learn anything new and you'll likely get bored. On the other hand, if the content is too difficult, you'll get frustrated and discouraged, and you're not learning effectively. Comprehensible input means being able to guess or deduce, to infer the meaning from the context. Now it's easier to experience this with visual media, where images and situations help clarify meaning. But even without visual, while reading plain text or listening to audio, you can still benefit from it. And then choosing content that is engaging is just as important. Even if something is technically comprehensible, if you find it boring, it won't help. You won't stick with it and you won't absorb anything. Now there are 2 main types of immersion, both of which play an important role in language learning: active immersion and passive immersion. Active immersion, this means focused, undivided attention while listening or reading. No distractions, no phone, no multitasking. A highly effective method is also to take handwritten notes while watching or listening. This physical engagement boosts your attention, and attention is the first step towards retention. Passive immersion, on the other hand, involves listening to content in the background while doing other tasks like cooking, commuting, or walking. It serves a different neurological function. Your brain continues to process the language subconsciously, even without focused attention. The powerful thing is to combine both approaches. Active immersion helps you notice patterns, internalize grammar, and absorb vocabulary more effectively. then passive re-exposure to the same content reinforces what you've already learned. And this combination is powerful. Your brain strengthens the connections and consolidates the input. And you can use this strategy, this approach, for example, with podcasts or YouTube videos, where you read the transcript along the first time, and then you rewatch, you re-listen passively. And again, you'll notice how much more of the language sticks in this way. So let's now move on to active skills, writing and speaking. Let's start with writing. How can we work on this skill effectively? I highly recommend handwriting rather than just typing because it improves retention. Writing by hand engages more areas of the brain, particularly those linked to motor memory and attention, and it helps fix vocabulary more deeply in the long-term memory. A great technique is dictation. Dictation reinforces spelling, listening accuracy, and your ability to process the language in real time, combining passive and active elements. You can also try sentence mining, which means collecting useful phrases from your reading or listening material and writing them down to review later. And of course, exchanging messages is another really good way to practice writing. You can do that, for example, on language exchange platforms. And it's a fun way to practice writing with native speakers. And then there is speaking, which is the most intense workout for your language brain. Whether you practice with a language partner, a tutor, or just record yourself speaking, forces your brain to do something quite demanding, to retrieve, organize, and produce language in real time. Two incredibly useful techniques here are shadowing and chorusing. Shadowing involves repeating what you hear just a second or two behind the speaker, and you can do this while listening or while reading and listening together. It trains your ear, your mouth, and your memory at the same time, helping with pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation. Chorusing, on the other hand, means repeating together with the speaker, like singing along. This is especially helpful for building fluency and natural phrasing. Now, when it comes to active skills, one of the most important things to understand is that this is how you activate your vocabulary. Essentially, this is how you convert your passive vocabulary, the words and structures you can understand, into active vocabulary, the words you can actually use in speech and writing. At the beginning, you rely heavily on declarative memory, the type of memory used for facts and information. You consciously recall vocabulary, grammar rules, and sentence patterns. You keep translating in your head. And this system is associated with areas like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which help you retrieve stored knowledge. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, but as you practice, especially through repetition, speaking and writing, your brain gradually transitions to using procedural memory. This is the kind of memory involved in skills and habits, like riding a bike or playing an instrument. Language starts to become more automatic and intuitive. You no longer need to think about the rule or translate in your head. You just use it. And this procedural memory is linked to brain regions like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which handle automated actions and smooth coordination. Essentially, the more you practice, the more you shift language from your thinking brain to your doing brain. But the transition doesn't happen on its own. It requires active use, and quite often a lot of frustration comes with it, because stepping into active skills means stepping outside your comfort zone, and yet that discomfort is part of the process, really. It's important to remember that you learn through your mistakes. This is not school. You're not being graded. Making mistakes is exactly how your brain figures out what needs fixing. So instead of fearing mistakes, embrace them. They are signposts on the road to fluency. Many people, myself included, have found this phase frustrating, but once you become more comfortable with the idea that mistakes are part of learning, you'll progress faster and with less mental resistance. Having said that, it's important to activate your language as soon as you're ready. The key word here is ready, not perfect. It's important not to jump into speaking too early, which is before you've had enough exposure and immersion. At the same time, you don't need to wait too long either. Many learners spend months or even years focusing almost exclusively on passive skills because they feel safer. But if you want to speak, at some point you have to start speaking. I've heard many learners say something like, I've been using Duolingo for so many years now and I still can't speak, or I've studied grammar and attended classes for months or years, but when it comes to actually speaking, I freeze. I can't form a sentence. And unfortunately, this is incredibly common. The main reason, they haven't spent enough time activating their vocabulary, or they haven't spent any time at all activating their vocabulary. So, how do we activate our vocabulary? Essentially through recalling, which is trying to remember and use the words and the structures we've encountered. And this could happen during conversation, for example, or using a structured method like spaced repetition systems, such as Anki, which help you remember vocabulary, revise vocabulary over time by reviewing it at optimal intervals, or the gold list method, where you write down new words or expressions, ideally in context, with a phrase or a sentence, and then review and reduce the list over time until the vocabulary becomes part of your long-term memory. Activation, moving words from the I recognize this category to the I can use this category. And finally, last but not least, grammar. This is a hot topic and even a bit of a polarizing one within the language learning community. There are two main schools of thought. On one side, those who are strongly in favor of grammar, arguing that you can't learn to speak properly without it. And on the other side, those who are strongly against it, claiming that immersion and practice matter more, that you can learn to speak the language correctly throughout usage alone. My position lies somewhere between these two extremes. I do think grammar is useful, but we need to see it as a support tool, not the foundation. Grammar is something that can clarify, connect, and help us understand patterns, but it's not the centerpiece of language learning. Traditional education tends to put grammar at the core. We are taught to believe that correct language comes from following grammar rules, but in reality that's a myth. Grammar rules were created to describe how people already use the language. So grammar isn't a set of laws we must obey, it's more an attempt to bring structure to what is actually a very messy and fluid system. That's why there are so many exceptions, because language evolves and it doesn't always follow neat patterns. Having said that, while I strongly believe that comprehensible input and language acquisition are essential, I also believe that grammar has its place In fact, I think grammar can be helpful from the beginning, alongside the pronunciation and core vocabulary, because it gives you an early understanding of the language structure, which forms a base to build on. So, do we really need grammar? The short answer is not necessarily. The brain is very good at noticing patterns and figuring out grammar rules on its own through enough exposure, but this is a slow process, and this is the reason why some basic grammar knowledge is useful. Grammar should be seen not as the main focus, but as a way to support and speed up comprehension. Grammar is a temporary aid, something you use to scaffold your understanding until your brain internalizes those patterns naturally through use. In other words, you don't need to master grammar before you start using the language, and you definitely shouldn't let grammar stop you from practicing or speaking. But having a basic grammatical foundation can make a big difference, especially in the early stages. You only need just enough grammar to understand how the language works. Don't waste time on obscure rules or advanced topics you haven't even encountered yet. You'll learn most of those things organically through reading, listening, and interacting with the language. Of course, grammar can also be something you actively practice, particularly through writing. So doing grammar exercises can be helpful as long as they are meaningful and linked to your needs. For instance, I personally practice grammar deliberately when I work on verbs of motion in Russian or Polish, which are quite complex and don't really exist in Italian or English. And the same goes for case systems in languages like Polish, Russian, or German or Greek, where grammar rules are more central to basic communication. But again, grammar is most useful when it appears in context, when you've already encountered a certain structure and your brain is primed to make sense of it. That's when it clicks. That's when it becomes real. So yes, grammar matters, but only when it serves the bigger goal, helping you make sense of the language so you can understand it and eventually use it confidently. It's time now to wrap up this long video. Here's a tip. It's essentially all about how you combine these elements. And of course, it's important to adapt. It's important to choose the techniques, the approach, the methods that best suit you. Give the video a like and subscribe for more content like this. Let me know in the comments what skills are you struggling with the most right now? What techniques, what strategies are you using? I'd love to help, and I'd love to hear from you about your experience. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye now.